In 1346, Edward III won a great victory in battle at Crécy during the Hundred Years' War. From there he would march on Calais. Edward's siege of Calais became a protracted one, and it was hardly a surprise when the king's mood darkened. For those inside Calais, however, things were even worse. It was said that even the strongest of men became so weakened with starvation that he could barely find the strength to stand, never mind defend Calais from the besieging English army. Eventually, the defenders were forced to surrender and throw themselves on Edward's mercy. Edward, however, was not inclined to show them that mercy. However, he was eventually persuaded to spare most of the inhabitants on the condition that he would take 6 of their more prominent men prisoner, with whom he'd do as he pleased. Edward was in an unforgiving mood. He harboured resentment against Calais for their defiance and for the damage they had helped to inflict on him during naval engagements during the previous few years. Despite pleading for their lives, Edward had made up his mind that he would have the 6 men executed. However, there was one person who had enough influence over Edward to change his mind. That was his queen, Philippa, a woman known and loved for her compassion. Philippa threw herself upon the ground and pleaded with the king to spare his prisoners. Philippa, described as being heavily pregnant at the time, wept piteously, whilst Edward watched on silently for a time. Eventually the king relented, making it plain that it had only been thanks to Philippa's intervention that the men had not been executed. The gentle queen thanked her husband profusely before leading the captives away, ensuring they were given new clothes and fed before they were escorted to safety. This is one of the most famous stories regarding Queen Philippa, and it was because of such kindness that she became one of England's most beloved medieval queens. And it wasn't just the English public who loved her either. Edward himself thought the world of Philippa. He, a battle hardened warrior king, contrasted perfectly with this kindly, pious woman, and perhaps that's why this marriage would become one of the most successful relationships in English royal history. Edward, during Philippa's lifetime, would meet a woman named Alice Perez and keep her as his mistress. This, however, was common for medieval kings to do, especially when their own wife was getting on in years. This did not alter the fact that Edward loved Philippa dearly, and he was distraught at her passing in 1369. Indeed, his once magnificent reign would never quite be the same again after Philippa had died. It can be said, however, that the beginnings of Edward's and Philippa's marriage did not seem to bode well for the future. Edward's father, Edward II, had decided on a marriage alliance with the Count of Hainault, with one of the Count's daughters being a potential bride for his son and heir. The following is a description of either Philippa or her sister, written by Walter Stapledon, who was sent to inspect the girls by Edward II. The lady whom we saw has not uncomely hair, betwixt blue, black, and brown. Her face narrows between the eyes, and its lower part is more narrow than her forehead. Her eyes are blackish brown and deep. Her body is well set and unmaimed, and naught is amiss so far as a man may see. Moreover, she is brown of skin all over, much like her father. She is neither too tall nor too short for such an age. She is of fair carriage. The damsel is well taught in all that becometh her rank, and highly esteemed and well beloved by her parents. So, if this is indeed describing Philippa, then she would make an ideal match for the younger Edward. However, by 1326, Edward II was in massive trouble. He'd alienated his wife, Queen Isabella, beyond repair, and it would be Isabella who arranged the marriage between the younger Edward and Philippa. Isabella was seeking the Count, Philippa's father, as an ally in her eventually successful attempt to overthrow Edward II. Prince Edward was a charismatic young man, and he left a big impression on Philippa during their first meeting. It's said that, as Edward took his leave from Philippa, the young girl was in tears, distraught at having to be parted from Edward as she watched him sail away. Edward's and Philippa's marriage formally took place in early 1328, but in the midst of a rather gloomy political backdrop. Edward II had been deposed and murdered the previous year, and although the younger Edward was now King Edward III, he was devastated at what happened to his father. What was worse was that he was now being outshone by his own mother Isabella and her ally, the insufferably arrogant Roger Mortimer, until 1330, when Edward III dramatically cast off the shackles that had been imposed upon him by his regents. He and Philippa would be left out in the cold. But 1330 was a decisive year for Edward and Philippa, as Edward arrested his mother and Mortimer, banishing the former in disgrace and executing the latter. That year also saw the birth of Edward's and Philippa's first child, a boy named after his father, and who would come to be known to history as the Black Prince. Philippa would give Edward a whole host of children, and what is interesting about this is the fact that Philippa chose to breastfeed each child. This was unusual for a royal woman in a medieval period, as ordinarily she would employ a wet nurse. But providing children to suit the political purposes of her husband was not Philippa's only role. As Edward marched on Calais in 1346, Philippa had remained in England, acting as the king's regent. She had a serious problem to deal with during her time as regent. Edward's rival in France, King Philip VI, had turned to France's old ally, the Scots, to cause trouble in northern England. King David II of Scotland duly obliged and invaded the north of England. Philippa gathered together an army to defend the north of the country, which was complicated by the fact that many of England's most powerful men were with Edward in France. However, the English army marched north, and Philippa made her presence felt, urging her men on, and they joined battle with the Scots at the Battle of Neville's Cross. Inspired by Philippa's words, the English routed the Scots, and even better, captured their king, David II. Not long after, Philippa would join her husband in France. But it was compassion that Philippa was renowned for. In 1331, she had saved some carpenters from Edward's wrath. During a tournament, a platform seating Philippa and her mother, Joan, collapsed. Edward was irate, as it was only thanks to pure luck that nobody was hurt or killed. As was the case at Calais in 1347, Edward was disinclined to show mercy to the men who had built the platform and was certainly going to execute them. But Philippa's intervention put a stop to that. That public show of kindness won her the hearts of many, and that continued throughout her life. Philippa was praised liberally by medieval chroniclers. She was described as being a very good and charming person who exceeded most ladies for sweetness of nature, as well as being the most gentle, liberal, and courteous that ever was queen in her days. Philippa died quietly at Windsor Castle in 1369. Sitting with her at the time was her grief-stricken husband and their youngest son, Thomas. Philippa, staying true to her nature to the very end, comforted Edward and pleaded with him to ensure that all her affairs were put in order, such as ensuring those who had been employed by her were paid. Selfless to the last, Philippa then asked Edward to ensure that when his time came, he would be buried alongside her at Westminster Abbey. The old king, in tears, could do nothing but oblige. With Philippa's passing, the golden days of Edward III's magnificent reign passed with her.